Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining us today because we're going to demystify some of the absolute biggest external forces that shape modern business strategy. We're doing a deep dive into macro-environmental scanning, but we're really zooming in on the economic environment. And we're not just looking at it in a vacuum, right? We're framing the E in pestle as the true gravitational center of your entire macro-environmental scan, that critical pillar where abstract political maneuvers or shifting social tides ultimately translate into hard dollars and cents. Let's get right to it.
Okay, so here's our quick roadmap for today. First, the pestle framework explained. Second, defining the economic environment. Third, core economic elements. Fourth, tricky categorizations, what counts. And finally, number 5, the strategic impact. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the pestle framework explained. So I've got a question for you. What truly drives business survival when the macro environment shifts? Seriously, think about it for a second. As a manager or a strategist, you can optimize your internal supply chain or perfectly calibrate your company culture all day long. But what dictates if a company thrives or just completely tanks when things change outside its four walls? You can't single-handedly control global inflation. You can't reverse a sudden demographic shift. It all comes down to understanding and anticipating those massive external forces that are totally beyond your immediate control but still completely dictate your operational reality.
And that's exactly where the pestle matrix comes in. It's this fundamental scanning tool built specifically to organize the chaos of the macro environment into 6 interconnected pillars: political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. By scanning these specific areas, management is forced to be proactive, thinking ahead instead of just constantly putting out fires. But the really vital part is understanding how these pillars interact. Political decisions almost always create new economic realities. Economic downturns instantly shift social behaviors. It's like a giant puzzle. Today, though, we're putting the blinders on and focusing entirely on that second column, because the economic environment, well, it acts as the ultimate financial reality check for all the other 5.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining the economic environment.
Let's dive into what this actually means. The source materials are super clear here. Economic factors are expressly financial in nature. Now, this is a profoundly important distinction. Why? Because in the real world of strategy, figuring out what is expressly financial can actually be pretty tricky. Cultural trends and economic realities blur together all the time. Like, is a sudden boom in sustainable products a social movement or an economic shift? By strictly defining the economic environment as quantifiable, mathematical realities, stuff that directly regulates the exchange of money, energy, and materials, we strip away the feelings. We separate a shifting social trend from a hard, quantifiable reality. And that gives us a much sharper lens for risk assessment and resource allocation.
All right, on to Section 3, core economic elements.
The economic environment a business interacts with is essentially the sum total of 3 highly organized subcategories. You've got economic systems, economic policies, and economic conditions. Every piece of complex financial data, every global market trend, and every localized spending habit you analyze, it's all going to slot fundamentally into one of these 3 buckets.
First up, economic systems. Whether you're navigating a largely capitalist framework like the United States, a strongly socialist-leaning economy like China, or a mixed economy like India, the overarching system dictates the baseline rules of engagement. We aren't just talking about abstract theory here. We're talking about how these systems dictate critical real-world strategic moves, things like capital flow, regulatory hurdles, or how you even enter a market in the first place. The system basically tells a business exactly how much friction they're going to face from the government when trying to operate and scale.
Next, we have economic policies. Think of these as the deliberate, mechanical levers pulled by a government to shape its country's economy. This includes monetary and fiscal policies, export-import policies, and industrial policies. And this is where we really see the interconnectedness of pestle. A government's political ideology directly drives these exact economic levers. A sudden change here can have a massive asymmetrical impact on the market. For instance, a political decision to liberalize imports might heavily subsidize domestic industries that rely on imported raw materials, but at the exact same time, it could completely crush local manufacturers who are suddenly facing cheaper foreign competition.
And finally, the third bucket, economic conditions. These operate directly in the market on a day-to-day basis. We're analyzing national income, interest rates, and the stock market. These forces are constantly fluctuating and directly influence the crucial supply and demand of goods and services. And hey, it's really important to remember that something like the stock market isn't just a financial tool for investors. It heavily dictates everyday consumer confidence.
When the market drops, consumer discretionary spending often just freezes, and that ripples out into the entire operational environment. If interest rates spike, borrowing costs go up, and business expansion fundamentally slows down. It's pure economic gravity.
Okay, Section 4, Tricky Categorizations. What actually counts?
You know, it is incredibly easy to miscategorize external factors when you're doing a pestle analysis, and that can lead to some really flawed strategies. So let's do a little myth busting. A lot of folks mistakenly assume demographics like population size, literacy rates, age distribution are economic indicators. Actually, scratch that. They absolutely are not. The texts consistently place demographics firmly under the social or sociocultural umbrella. Let's draw a hard line here. Demographics deal with people. The economic environment deals with money. Keeping them strictly separated keeps your strategic thinking sharp. Contrast demographics with the stock market, which is expressly financial, making it strictly economic. Here's another one that trips people up all the time. Values versus competition. Values represent deeply ingrained moral principles and cultural norms. They are the furthest thing from quantifiable financial data, firmly placing them as sociocultural forces or internal philosophies. But competition? Competition is fascinating. You might think competitive rivalry is just a localized, industry-level thing. But structurally, the scale, number, and size of your competitors represent a dominant, quantifiable economic force within your operating space. So officially, yep, competition is categorized as a core economic driver.
Precision in your scanning really is everything. Let's take a geopolitical example like NAFTA. Now, it was obviously drafted, debated, and signed by politicians, which makes it highly visible in the political sphere. But fundamentally, it's a regional trade association aimed at improving and regulating trade. So while politicians set the stage, the ultimate classification for a business's survival strategy is economic. It governs the financial exchange across borders, perfectly bridging that gap between the P and the E in pestle.
All right, bringing it home with Section 5, the strategic impact.
Let's tie this all together and look at the real-world impact. The source materials highlight a brilliant mechanism that grounds all this theory in stark reality. Prevailing economic conditions don't just exist in a vacuum. They immediately and forcefully dictate how people actually spend their money. The text explicitly calls out global events like the 2007 financial crisis, proving that changes in the macroeconomic environment can dramatically and instantly alter the competitive landscape for literally any operating business.
And here's the really granular impact of that. When economic conditions worsen, say interest rates shoot up or unemployment spikes, consumers react instantly. The text gives us this direct cause and effect. People facing financial hardship will aggressively cut back on sports, recreation, holidays, new cars, luxury goods, you name it. The consumption of non-essential goods is instantly depressed. So you've got to ask yourself a really tough strategic question. When unemployment spikes, do your customers still prioritize your product, or do you suddenly become a non-essential good? This is exactly why businesses obsess over the E in pestle. It dictates the exact size of their customers' wallets.
Which brings us to our final thought. The economic environment isn't just some abstract strategic concept. It's the expressly financial, mathematical reality of your operating space. While it's just one of the 6 pillars in the holistic pestle framework, it is the one that most aggressively enforces the math of survival. So, if competition and interest rates are purely economic forces shaping your market every single day, you have to look closely at your own organization and ask, is your current strategy actually protecting your bottom line against these shifts? Are you really scanning the whole horizon, or are you just ignoring the math? Think about that. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep adapting, and I'll catch you next time.